Dante, the strongest devil hunter of history, versus Nero, the strongest devil hunter of today. I'll be pitting Nero against every main version of Dante, seeing at just which point in the series Nero surpasses his predecessor. Without wasting any more time, let's get into this. The first matchup will of course be Nero versus Devil May Cry 3 Dante, and this I think is mainly dependent on which point in these two games we're using. If it's early Devil May Cry 3 Dante against early Devil May Cry 4 Nero, Nero is winning without much challenge, since Nero at this point is arguably comparable to Sparda. Well, if you watch my video on Pluto, I explained specifically how Devil May Cry 3 Dante scales in comparison to Sparda. If we're taking the pair from their respective awakenings, Nero should still win, but I'm less confident on that in this scenario, since Nero doesn't awaken an actual Devil Trigger, and his base doesn't seem to increase as much. So I think Dante gets a superior amp overall, but even with this, I think just having Dante with Devil Trigger about as strong as Sparda, with Nero's previous state being that same level. So Nero at this point should just be unquantifiably stronger than this Dante and Sparda, both of them being unquantifiably stronger by the end of their respective games. But Nero also has the Yamato, which means his arsenal just becomes better than Dante's ability-wise, so I think Nero is just high-diffing Dante at any point in this game. Now with Devil May Cry 1 Dante fighting the same Nero, it goes pretty much the same way, but in reverse. Devil May Cry 1 Dante from the get-go in base is as strong as, if not stronger than, Sparda, with Devil Trigger already available to him to double this power, which just eclipses Nero's power at this point, and using Nero from right before Devil May Cry 5 goes the same way, as even then he doesn't get much stronger in base, and he's still significantly weaker than Dante, even being famously remarked as dead weight. But now the tide will turn into a constant Nero stomp for a bit, as Nero, after obtaining the Devil Breakers and fighting Urizen again, is a monster. He outperforms Devil Trigger Dante against a stronger Urizen than the one Dante fought, as Urizen is constantly getting stronger through the Qliphotep pumping power into him. This means base Devil May Cry 5 Nero is as strong as, or above, Devil Trigger Devil May Cry 5 Dante. So obviously Nero is just washing through Devil May Cry 1 Dante with ease. Even though Devil May Cry 4 is further down the timeline now, I'll be going over Devil May Cry 4 Dante first. I'll say why when I go over Devil May Cry 2 Dante. A common thought process is that Devil May Cry 4 Dante is weaker physically than Devil May Cry 4 Nero, but this just makes absolutely zero sense and isn't consistent with narrative, feats, or statements. The line of thought comes from the Deadly Fortune Part 2, a novel depicting the events of Devil May Cry 4, but the context is iffy at best. I think the first definition of strong is the most fitting here as far as his actual physical strength went, since this scene is depicting him grabbing and throwing around the Savior, which is utterly massive, which is a very physically demanding task, just in a different way than raw AP. His demonic power coming from his arm is literally primarily Yamato's, so the implication that the demonic energy flowing off of Nero's arm is superior to Devil May Cry 4 Dante is insane, especially considering the fact Dante should already be familiar with Yamato and know very well he isn't inferior to it as far as his actual power goes. The narrative disagrees with him being weaker than this Nero as well, as in Visions of V and Devil May Cry 5, Nero is just very consistently weaker, fodder, and barely even a worthy substitute for Dante at this point, so Nero being even stronger than Dante just was and is completely consistent. Feats-wise, this is dog shit too, considering Dante has long surpassed weak-ass characters that are barely even using the Devil Sword Sparda's power, even as far back as Devil May Cry 3. Devil Breaker Nero still just does win though, regardless, as he's stronger than a stronger Dante. Now, Devil May Cry 2 Dante is an interesting case, as unlike Devil May Cry 4, he has his Majin form, which is a very unique and powerful transformation that only definitively appears in Devil May Cry 2, although it has similar features to Dante's shadowy demonic form in the Devil May Cry 3 manga. But even with this form, he's only performing similar feats to a pre-Devil May Cry 5 Dante, as Dante in base beats Balrog, who is stated as strong as, if not stronger than, Argisax. So Nero should still win, even if we don't know the true upper limit to the Majin form, since just assuming it wins off of that would be committing to a no limits fallacy. Early Devil May Cry 5 Dante versus Devil Breaker Nero is obviously going to Nero, as I already explained, but now post-coma Dante is beating Nero again. Due to after his coma, he becomes much stronger in base to the point of outright beating seated Urizen. As for how long he used Sin Devil Trigger before returning to base is unknown, but he's still easily on this level alongside his feat of stomping King Cerberus in base, with King Cerberus being above the likes of Balrog, Burial, Argisax, etc., which I'll explain in a different video because he's way too underrated. So this Dante in base is already on Nero's level again and has Devil Trigger as well as Sin Devil Trigger on his side now. Now with Devil Trigger Nero, this will be a hot take, but he's only beating base Dante and maybe normal Devil Trigger. He only interacts with a fatigued Dante and Virgil who are also already damaged, with Virgil likely holding back against him in context too. He definitely has grounds of beating base Dante due to the Devil Trigger amp and almost killing base Dante with the backhand, which although it is a fatigued and damaged Dante, it's alright since he just isn't winning past this. Devil Trigger Dante should just win since Dante has a stronger base, so having the same multiplier should be leaning into Dante's favor. But Nero could take it seeing as his Devil Trigger is different, but it's just guesswork to say if it's a bigger amp or big enough to overshadow Dante's. And then obviously Sin Devil Trigger exists, and Sin Devil Trigger is an absolutely fucking massive amp, even being arguably infinite. The reason it's arguably infinite is that it's even greater than the amp the Clyfoth gave to Urizen, with the Clyfoth being said to be such a large amp that it literally gives you the power to rule everything. And once Urizen consumes it, he's stated to become the ultimate expression of killing power. Mundus, upon consuming it, also goes from being essentially a random fodder demon to a 4-dimensional god that can beat other 4-dimensional characters. So Sin Devil Trigger is just an unreasonably large amp that would drag 1,000 Devil Trigger Neros through the dirt. So effectively the chain of scaling goes Sin Devil Trigger Dante, massively above Devil Trigger Dante, equal to or above Devil Trigger Nero, who is above base Dante, who is in turn above Devil Breaker Nero, who beats Devil May Cry 4, Devil May Cry 2, and Devil May Cry 1 Dante, who is above Devil May Cry 4 and early Devil May Cry 5 Nero, who is finally above Devil May Cry 3 Dante. I'd say this is pretty set in stone without much wiggle room for replacements, as is until we get new material. But nonetheless, both are Virgil victims, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. See ya. Now this week's video is going to be a double, both due to the first part being shorter than I'd hope, and somewhat as an apology to anyone following my content for Devil May Cry, since I haven't really been on top of it in a while. Don't worry, Devil May Cry and the Dark Souls games other than Elden Ring will both have their time probably around the beginning of December. I digress. The second part of this video will be dedicated to how Sparda compares to the rest of the verse, and this is probably one of my hottest takes regarding Devil May Cry. As I explained in the aforementioned Pluto video, Devil May Cry 3 Dante after awakening the Devil Trigger should be relative to Sparda, and Arkham should also scale directly to Sparda. But Sparda being in these ranges is actually pretty consistent. As I explained before as well, Devil May Cry 4 Nero at the very beginning is compared to Sparda as well, and this isn't even really contradicted. And Devil May Cry 1 Dante has numerous statements in the game, as well as the unfinished manga regarding him as an equal to or surpassing Sparda even in base. And that's when it boils down to really being that Sparda never really surpassed Mundus, and Dante's special Devil Trigger is not Sparda's power. Anyone with a bit of knowledge on Devil May Cry should be in the know that emotional and mental amps in this verse are extraordinarily prevalent, clearing the difference of being completely stomped to actually winning a fight. We see this with Dante versus Virgil in Devil May Cry 3, where Dante was still weaker up until his conviction surpassed Virgil's. Hell, this is extremely noticeable in Devil May Cry 1 with Dante versus Nero Angelo, with Virgil legitimately stomping Dante in their first encounter, and then having an emotional breakdown that destabilized his power. So where I'm going with this is Sparda's conviction far surpassed Mundus, temporarily heavily amping him. Not only this, but Mundus was straight up stomping him at first until Sparda blatantly gained a ton of motivation due to Mundus taunting, and Mundus had already injured Sparda. But wait, Sparda being injured would make him weakened, right? No. Demons in Devil May Cry get stronger when injured, so Sparda had multiple layers of amps when he began to overwhelm Mundus, and before said temporary amps, he was getting decimated. And yeah, Devil May Cry 1 Dante's Sparda Devil Trigger had no real connection to channeling Sparda's own power. This is stated to be Dante's true power. Dante's, not Sparda's. And Dante had already surpassed Sparda in base as well, as likely contending Mundus in base as well. But that's a topic I'll address in the future. And I guess while I'm at it, Sparda had help against Argisax, and him having his power sealed is just unlikely. There's statements supporting Sparda sealing his power away, sure, but that story is inconsistent, with some stating he just sealed himself away, as well as coming from characters legitimately just citing the legend surrounding him, which would have no real bearing due to its status as simply a legend, and there were already misconceptions surrounding Sparda that sprouted from it. And if Sparda really sealed away or split his actual demonic power into three, then how come, as a being with no demonic energy, he somehow pops out the two beings with the highest concentration of demonic energy to ever exist? Like, that's not something that just comes from simply having a semblance of demon physiology. If they had no source to even be born with demonic energy, then they simply wouldn't have it, especially due to the fact they're physically simply more human than demon until their blood is awakened. The same goes for Nero, who had very trace amounts of demonic energy without Yamato until he awakened his Devil Trigger. So yeah, Sparda being some like Sin Devil Trigger level fighter, or even being in like the top 10, just isn't really that likely. Anyways, that's this week's video. Hope y'all have a great rest of your day, and see ya.